Okay, hello everybody, and we're going to start week 11 now. And what we're going to do today, the only activity we really got is to talk about the third exam, which is coming up this week. And it's going to cover part of chapter 7, and that part I'll talk about here in a second, and chapters 8 and 9. So it's not really a lot in terms of reading. It is some pretty important content, and it's some pretty technical reading in a lot of ways. So you want to make sure you have a good read on that material prior to taking the exam. I think that'd be really good advice for anybody. So the exam, again, is going to be available in the same format as before. It's going to be 40 multiple choice questions, and you can take it in class here on Wednesday during regular class time, or you can take it at one of the testing centers, or if you prefer, which is what most people are doing, simply taking a bright space between now and Sunday. And the final due date for that is 11:59 p.m. on Sunday. So you can turn that in anytime between now and between Wednesday and Sunday. It's not available yet. It will be available after class on Wednesday. The Wednesday class session, I'll have a regular Zoom session open, just in case anybody has any last minute questions. It's just a last chance to sort of talk with me and ask a question. If you're studying for the exam and you're sort of stuck on something, you want some additional input, I'll be here. And so you can do that. I know last time people sort of popped into the Zoom room and wondered what I was doing sitting there, and I was just waiting for your questions. And so there's no regular class session that day. It's basically an exam day. And given the fact that people really don't seem to be taking the exam in class, and I don't think we anticipated that. This is the first semester that our school, Humanities and Social Sciences, has done the Attend Anywhere. We may just make this a regular class session going forward and just put it online. That might be the thing, but that was not anticipated. We really thought that people were going to be coming into class much more frequently. And it does seem that most people prefer the distance learning aspect of it, which is perfectly fine. But I think that does sort of, it's a little bit awkward in that sense that there's no actual class that day. So, but I will be here. So if you need help, I'll be more than happy to help you. So I apologize for my voice. I've got seasonal allergies and they're starting to kick in. So about this time of year every year, I'm sort of afflicted with this. And so I'm not sick with COVID or anything like that, I don't think. I had all my shots, but it's just simply a matter of trying to deal with the congestion and whatnot. So anyway, let's talk about the exam. And I'm going to probably try to swivel the camera over here a little bit so that I can, there we go. So that I can sort of talk about the exam a little bit and what to expect. And I'm going to be sort of looking at my notes here so that I can sort of better prepare you for what to expect on the exam itself on Wednesday and Wednesday through the Sunday into the class period. Okay. So anyway, if anybody pops in and has questions, feel free to raise your hand, sort of the virtually raise your hand, or simply type something in the chat box. We haven't resolved the issue, and it's unresolved, as it turns out. The matter of my hearing you, and I think I mentioned last week that I thought for a long time that I could hear you, which has nobody had said anything yet. But that turns out I have to have the projector on, which is a big beam of light, and that doesn't really work with what we're doing here. So anyway, so this exam itself is basically going to cover the beginnings of market structure. Market structure theory, as we've been talking, is this economics of the firm discussion, where we basically say that all business firms in all industries can be placed in one of four industrial structures. Excuse me, and those are respectively perfect competition, monopoly, and those first two are the ones that we're going to be covering on this exam this week. The monopolistic competition and oligopoly we'll get to next week. So we come back on week 12, we'll be covering those. I think we'll probably get through both of those. Then we'll move on in weeks 13 and 14 to talk about some of the remaining bits that we have. So we're nearing sort of the end of the semester now. We're over the halfway point, so we're moving kind of quickly here. Excuse me. So anyway, what to expect for the exam? I'll sort of take some of these in the order in which I wrote them. They'll be scrambled on the exam. So if you're talking to somebody on the phone, your number 14 may be different than somebody else's, just because the program just sort of randomizes these. So, and again, you'll have an hour and a half to take the exam. Excuse me, which should be, I think, plenty of time to complete it. At least I hope it is. So that's my objective, at least. Okay, so what about chapter 7 that we should know? So on chapter 7, which was really the beginning, it was sort of an intro. It was a very important chapter, as I think I mentioned to the class a number of times. It's very important in the sense that it sort of lays out these sort of mechanics for the way that we analyze firms in terms of costs and revenue and output and profitability and all those things which are totally critical to our understanding of the firm. And I think I've mentioned this before, but it also dovetails nicely with some of the classes which most of you, if you're in the business, if you're going to be planning to have business education, you'll no doubt see again, no question about it. So this is sort of the underpinnings of that. And the part that will be coming for exam 3 really deals more with the long-term aspects, particularly long-run fixed costs, as well as economies of scale and diseconomies of scale. And so that's really all that we'll be covering. I think there are 8 questions from chapter 7 on the exam, and then 16 each from chapters 8 and 9 is the way I think I structured this exam. And the exam is basically complete in terms of question selection. So it's just a matter of putting these up and making these available to you. And again, I should mention also, if you get kicked out of the system for whatever reason, I don't know that it'll let you back in. So if it does, it does. But if it doesn't, then let me know and send me a quick email. I'll try to get back to you as quickly as possible. I do try to, during exam weekends, try to make myself available just because of the fact that there are sometimes some technical glitches. It's not as common as it used to be, fortunately, but it does happen. So what to know on chapter 7? Well, first of all, know what a fixed cost is. So we said the fixed costs are those costs which don't vary with the level of production. So as a result of this, and we're talking about, now there is the reality that we talked about was the fact that all costs in the long run are variable, but in the short run, all costs are either fixed or variable. And those costs in the very short run are fixed, which represent fixed inputs like salaries, rental expense, leases on premises, things like interest, insurance costs. Those are fixed costs. And so even like startup costs that are going to be there, even if you're producing zero output, you're going to have fixed costs. Okay, so those fixed costs are going to be there. And so as a result of this, they don't change with the level of production. Okay. In the long run, they do because inputs will change. And that's really part of what the issue is over the longer term situation. So, and then over the longer term situation, we talked about this idea that if you spread out those fixed costs over larger amounts of volume, because remember what average fixed cost is. Average fixed cost is simply defined as, let's see what the camera is here. Average fixed cost is simply fixed cost over total output or quantity. So if this goes up and this stays the same, then this value must go down. And so as a result, average fixed cost begins to fall. And that's really a beautiful thing in a lot of ways, because it means that the fixed cost portion of the total cost of production goes down. So these firms that produce lots and lots and lots and lots of output see that the average fixed cost per unit become very, very small. And so this is why we have mass production of goods, because it allows a gigantic amount of production and the cost begins to fall, at least the fixed cost portion. The variable cost portion will probably begin to rise at some point just because of the fact that we use more materials and more variable cost labor and utilities and all that sort of thing. So, but that's the thing to know about, okay? Now, in the long run, firms tend to experience what's called economies of scale. Just simply know what that is. Economies of scale is simply a reduction in total costs, all costs, in which as the output rises, that average cost, which is the unit cost, begins to fall. That's what economies of scale are, is as the output produces over time. And this is it's on the long run average cost curve. And the long run average cost curve is simply that collection of individual smaller short run average cost curves, which are the original average cost curves we talked about before, average total cost, ATC. And when we talk about that, we're simply saying the average total cost is the cost per unit at whatever particular output level we're talking about. And so over time, because the input mix changes, then those cost curves change. So we have a series of those cost curves over time, but the long run, which is simply the addition of all of those, tends to go down, and you have this thing called long run economies of scale. It's the reduction in the unit costs as a firm gets bigger. And a lot of it's got to do also with this idea of declining average fixed cost. Because as you produce more output, you absorb. I mean, the cost of the president of the company's salary to produce one toaster is probably minuscule when it's captured in the cost of a toaster, for instance, if you're producing 2 million toasters a year, for instance. So you get the idea that you could drive those costs down, which is why it takes some of these big firms very little to produce a single unit of output. And I'm not talking about things like 747s and aircraft carriers. I'm talking about just ordinary items like televisions and sweaters and shoes. It doesn't cost much per unit in order to produce that because of economies of scale, okay? And then now what goes into category of fixed costs, salaries, rental expense, lease, et cetera, those kinds of things. And so you want to know what goes into that. Usually anything related to the premises themselves, you know, whether it's rents, you know, or interest expense or insurance is almost always considered a fixed cost because number one, it's independent of the output level. If you shut down for a month in order to remodel or clean or whatever, those fixed costs are going to continue because they're not based upon the activity, based upon what's being produced. Okay, so those costs will go on again and again. Okay, and then also know about basically the general profit equation, which is simply this. We talk about profit, and there's accounting profit and there's economic profit, but all profit is simply total revenue minus total costs. Okay, and total revenue is simply price times quantity minus total costs, which is average total cost times quantity, and that's the way that you compute profit. The only difference between accounting profit and economic profit is there's another layer of cost, and that is the implicit costs, which if there's a question dealing with that, it'll give you what that implicit or opportunity cost is. Implicit cost, opportunity cost, same thing. So it'll tell you what that is, and so you'll be able to compute it. So, but this is not something that's really all that, you know, illogical. I mean, I think we know that profit is the difference between inflows and outflows, right? And inflows are simply the price of the good times the quantity of goods. That's pretty straightforward. And the cost of goods is the number of goods you produce times the cost per unit to produce them. So that's not really all that illogical. And by the way, you'll have your book available in your notes and whatever, so you can use those. But keep in mind, you've got a time constraint, 90 minutes. So you're not going to have a whole lot of time to be looking things up. But in some ways, this is a lot of instructors don't like open book exams for that reason, that people get caught in the trap of not preparing, thinking that they have time to look things up when it's really not there. And I don't think econ is one of those classes that this works very well with. And I don't see it because I teach it. I'm just simply saying that that's my experience. So just as a word of the wise, I would try to be prepared as possible for the exam, so that when you do take the exam, those that are easily and straightforward answered, you can knock those out, and then you know, you can come back to the ones you haven't gotten before, and maybe do a little more research on those. Okay. Questions for me about anything at this point? I think that's about it for. Well, there's a couple of questions dealing with this idea of being able to compute total cost. So remember, total cost and then profit, but total cost is simply, and if total cost is ATC times TC, it's also the same thing as fixed cost plus variable cost, right? It's the very same thing, not average total cost, because that's, you know, divided by quantity, but it's simply the idea of fixed cost plus variable cost. And if you're given that, variable cost is simply the cost per unit, you know, a variable cost per unit times the number of units. That's fairly straightforward. So, and then average total cost is, and that's what total cost is equal to. Average total cost is equal to average fixed cost plus average variable cost. And so just simply know those relationships. And I think on the board, I wrote down all those as sort of a cheat sheet kind of thing. Hopefully you can reference those, maybe pull those out. So those are available to you on the exam. But there are a couple of questions dealing with, you know, being able to compute those particular things. And they're not going to be super difficult math problems. They're really not. Okay. Okay, so let's see, what else do we have here on chapter 7 to talk about? So I guess I should probably put my laptop up a little higher here so I can see it. So that's where my notes are. Okay, so we talked about economies of scale. That's the idea of a declining unit cost as output rises. Also know what diseconomies of scale are. That's the opposite condition in the long run, which costs are rising. And then there's less discussion in the book and also in class about that. It's basically a condition in which the firm has gotten so big that it's now got too much bureaucracy, too many facilities, it's just too expensive to operate. As a result, the firm gets less efficient economically as a result of this. So decreasing diseconomies of scale. It's also the very same thing as what's known as returns to scale, decreasing returns to scale. I didn't talk about this in class, but there's a question dealing with this, but it'll be obvious from the answer how to answer that. When you talk about returns to scale, your text talks about, so you can read this, it's simply for the inputs you put in, what you get back out, which then, and that's in units. So if I put fewer, so if I put the same units in and I get the more units out in terms of production, then I've got increasing returns to scale. Measured in dollars, that's called economies of scale. So one so the returns to scale question is units and economies of scale is dollars. So if I've got a situation where I'm putting units in and I'm getting less and less back, I'm getting decreasing returns to scale, which is in dollar terms is diseconomies of scale. That's all you need to know really about that. But I would read that, and I didn't go over it in class because it sort of is the same thing, but one deals with units and the other deals with dollars. And I think there's enough going on in chapter 7 that, excuse me, it's not really necessary to go over all that. Okay. All right. So I think that does it for chapter 7. Okay, so let's take a look at chapter 8 now. And chapter 8 takes us into the first of the market structures, and that's perfect competition. And so your text gets into a lot of detail about perfect competition, and just simply know what the characteristics are. There's also the PowerPoint package that I emailed you, really with regard to all of these chapters that should also assist you. I think the usefulness on this of that for exams is maybe a bit questionable, but nonetheless, it's there for you to use. It's for your benefit. So know what marginal revenue is and what marginal costs are. That's very important, particularly in the context of market structure. It's the idea of marginal revenue is the incremental benefit I get from selling one unit of output. If I sell one cup of coffee, how much do I get in terms of revenue? And the marginal cost is what did it cost me to produce that unit? Okay, so these margins. And again, when we first defined this idea of values in economics, we said there are 3 kinds of values. There are totals, and then there are averages, and there are marginals. And marginals is sort of the important aspect here because it's sort of where we live. That's if I do this much of something, how much benefit so it costs me to do that thing, how much benefit do I get back in terms of what's in it for me, so to speak. And for a business firm, it's profitability. Okay, so the difference between marginal revenue and marginal cost. Okay, and know about, in the case of perfect competition, we talked about this idea of shutdown point, and it's not the break-even point. So be careful not to distinguish break-even point, which is where price equals average total cost. But shutdown point is where price equals average variable cost. Price equals average variable cost, and that's the shutdown point. And you might be tempted to say, well, why don't we shut down at the break-even point where we're exactly breaking even? It's because it could be temporary, and prices do tend to be flexible in these particular markets, which are oftentimes very volatile in terms of price. And remember, these firms are price takers in perfect competition. So they're going to take whatever price is given, and at least they're covering their variable costs of production and maybe some of their fixed costs, if not all their costs, if they fall below average total cost on their way down to only average variable cost. So that's the shutdown point. Know what that particular point is there. Remember, the price and marginal revenue are the same in perfect competition. It's not the case in monopoly, and it won't be the case in the other 2 structures we'll talk about. But price and marginal revenue are one and the same imperfect competition. So you want to get familiar with that particular concept there. Okay. And then another difference between accounting profit and economic profit. It's simply one includes opportunity costs, that's the economic profit, and then the other does not, accounting profit. So accounting profit is always going to be greater than economic profit. Economic profit will always be less than accounting profit because it includes another layer of cost. And economic profit could be zero, it could be negative. It could be zero or negative for year after year. And in the case of perfect competition, we simply say that in the short run, there's possible profitability to be made, but firms come in to take away that profit. So the long run economic profit situation is considered to be zero. The long run equilibrium profit is zero. Okay. Okay, let me see here. Any questions for those who are on the live link here? Okay, let's see here. And they know about this idea of price takers, that a firm will take the price given and let me see here. I've got a particular question. And and then when we say a firm is a price takers, there's a question dealing with what happens if a firm raises the price above the market price. Remember, the firm in perfect competition takes the market price as given. There's no ability to alter the price. The only decision they make is the output decision. And as a result, they take the price that's given. If they try to raise the price, they lose sales. There's no question about it, because the products in this particular industry are undifferentiated. They are what they are, whether it's bales of potatoes or tomatoes or ears of corn, whatever. They're all, and I'll bring those agricultural outputs up because they do tend to all sort of fit into that category of perfect competition. Okay. Okay, what else in chapter 8 you should want to know about? Well, the other decision is the quantity decision. That's one thing you'll want to know about there with regard to perfect competition. Okay, let's see here. And the price equals marginal revenue. So make sure, also price equals marginal revenue. But it also equals its marginal cost. Okay, so price equals marginal revenue, but it also equals marginal cost in perfect competition. And the reason why is simply that a firm will always produce, all firms in all industries will always produce output where the marginal revenue equals marginal cost. It's this idea of the slot machine that I told you, that if you put a quarter in the slot machine, you get $1 back. And they keep on doing that because your marginal revenue exceeds your marginal cost. To the point where every time you put a quarter in, you get a quarter back. You should probably stop. If you're putting a quarter in and getting a dime back, you should not do any more of that. In this case, you should scale back. And so as a result, your marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That's your profit maximizing level of output. Even if that profit maximizing level of output results in zero profit or negative profit, it's still the maximum, even if it might be below zero. Okay. Okay, and let me see here. They know about total revenue, total cost, and what the connection between those are. It's not all that difficult to be the question dealing with that. It's relatively straightforward. We talked about the profit maximizing output level, where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. There's one question that there's a table given, and you'll compute the marginal revenue at a given output level. Remember, that's the same as the price, and you're going to be asked here to find out what level of output you should produce when marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So the main calculation is marginal cost, which again is the change in total cost. Where's my eraser? It's all the way down here, of course. Marginal cost is simply one of those incrementals. So all these marginals are simply incrementals. So marginal cost is simply the change in total cost divided by the change in quantity, or total product, whichever you prefer. But since we're bringing demand side into the picture now, so we might as well talk about quantity. So it's the change in total cost divided by the change in quantity, and that's from one incremental level to the next. Incremental level meaning 1 unit, 3 units to 4 units to 5 units. That sort of incremental. I did an example of that in class as well. Okay. And there are a couple of questions dealing with those particular scenarios. So Yeah, you might want to have a calculator available. It might benefit you, although the math is not intended to, to knock people out. It's not like that at all. Okay. Also, know about the fact that if the demand curve and marginal revenue are one and the same in perfect competition, then the supply curve and the marginal cost curve are one and the same in perfect competition. That's going to be different with monopoly because in monopoly, the demand and marginal revenue curves break apart from each other. We'll get to that in a minute. The demand and marginal revenue are one and the same for the firm in perfect competition, and the supply curve and the marginal cost curve are one and the same as well. So you want to know about that particular relationship there. Okay, let's see. I think we're getting about to the end of. There's one more here, a couple more in chapter 8. Then know what happens in how does this long run economic profit equaling zero come about? How do we get from a condition in which firms are making profits and then they're suddenly no longer making profits? Well, if a firm is making an accounting profit or an economic profit, then other firms will notice, and remember in this particular industry, economies of scale, or I'm sorry, barriers to entry are very low. Barriers to entry are very low, meaning that firms can come in. So if firms are making a lot of money, others will come in, suppliers that is. And as a result, the supply curve will shift to the right, bringing the price down to the point where now there's no more profit being made because the price has now fallen. So marginal revenue will again equal marginal cost. And if it falls too low, or marginal revenue drops down below marginal cost, firms will leave. And as firms leave, the supply curve goes back up again. This is one reason why you see the price of oil do what it does, is because suppliers coming in, suppliers leaving. And these adjustments aren't like overnight. It sometimes seems like that with gasoline. But they're over longer time periods. Why 2 or 3 years we have this cycle where gas prices are rising. Remember, it's based upon the price of oil. And it's because of the fact that suppliers have been leaving. Then it kind of comes down, falls for 2 or 3 years, comes back up, falls. This has been something that's been going on for decades. And it's mostly because of that situation where it's fairly easy to get involved in oil drilling. And it's not as easy as buying a car or something like that, but it's relatively easy to do that. And the firms that do it have already got the equipment. It's a matter of hiring the labor, and sometimes that's a challenge in itself, but it's nonetheless relatively easy. We see the barriers to entry are low, and so as a result, they can come in fairly quickly to take advantage of the high price. But that does shift the supply curve to the right, brings the price down. But ultimately, profit is zero. The barriers to exit are also low. They can also leave when the price is too low. Okay, so that's an important issue to consider there. Okay. And let me see here. And they know about how to compute profit. Basically, the fact that an opportunity cost includes explicit costs. So sort of know about that a little bit. Okay. And make sure you read the text as well, just that you're familiar with what is going on with those particular types of situations. And know how to interpret the graphs, know what they look like. Remember, you've got a horizontal marginal demand / marginal revenue curve in perfect competition. So you want to know about that. Okay. So I think that does it for the perfect competition chapter. So what about monopoly? It's the final chapter. Now, the good news is there are only 3 chapters to read. And, and even though we covered part of chapter 7 on exam 2, we sort of straddled some of this because some of it, it's all important. And we just didn't quite get through that for the second exam. But all the concepts there are still at work in this particular segment. They're going to be at work throughout the rest of the course. In fact, everywhere in microeconomics, we talk about the economics of the firm. These concepts are definitely at work. Okay, so monopoly. What about monopoly? So monopoly, you know what the characteristics are of that. Again, you can read that chapter. It's chapter 9. It's not a particularly long chapter. And we'll be talking about more of the aspects of monopoly in chapter 12 when we talk about some of the regulation of them, because one of the things about monopolies is they create inefficiencies for society as a whole. And so society has long ago figured out what to do about these inefficiencies. And they've attempted to regulate them, which is why utilities, which are a special form of monopoly, tend to have regulation as to price so that your electric company can't gouge you and double your electric bill or your natural gas bill or something like that, okay? So these government regulations are basically there. There are a couple of questions dealing with some of these barriers to entry that really form monopolies. Remember, we said that if barriers to entry are low or non-existent in perfect competition, they're very present in monopoly, which explains why the monopoly exists in the first place. Excuse me, and that is the idea. You've got things like patents and copyrights. And what are patents? Patents are product protections where somebody's got a new process or a new formula to do something and they're given a particular exclusive right to sell that product for X number of years. Like in the drug company, I think drugs are like 20 years, prescription drugs. And so that's what a patent is. That's that protection. Copyrights are for intellectual property, like written works or works of music or motion pictures, those kinds of things. Those are intellectual property regarding their protection. So there's a period of protection that the holder of the copyright has that protects that holder from being able or from being faced with competition, so that if somebody writes a book or a play or whatever, a song, nobody else can claim that, thereby reap the royalties from the eventual sale of that, which is what the economics of it are all about. Okay, so know about those particular barriers to entry, which try to protect the holders of those from competition, at least for a period of time. Okay. There's some questions about what are some examples of monopolies. And so you just want, and those will be very obvious, and you can infer from the readings and also from what we talked about in class, which would be most likely to be a monopoly. And we talked about some specific examples of firms that definitely would be good candidates for a monopoly. Okay. Okay, so in the case of monopoly, we said the definition is a single firm supplying all or mostly all of the industry's output. And we said mostly all because we gave a couple of examples of two historical monopolies, and they're by no means alone in their existence. But in each case, Standard Oil and Microsoft, neither one had more than, say, a 90% market share in the good that really attracted the attention of government. 90% we're saying is close enough to domination so that they really don't have to worry about competitors. Whatever competitors there are really small fry, and they're really sort of along for the ride. They're sort of riding the coattails of the bigger competitor. But those small competitors don't set the standard for the product itself. They don't set the price of the market. They don't, their output decisions are basically their own. They're almost like perfect competition in the sense that they sort of take the prices given. So the monopolist itself doesn't really need to worry about them so much. And so as a result, we say that these firms are price makers. So firms in perfect competition are price takers. Monopoly firms are price makers. And that's so again, and we talked about this idea in class that pretty much any characteristic that you can think of with regard to perfect competition, you can flip around on its head and reach the definition of monopoly, with the exception of profit maximization. And that is the idea that all firms in all industries will seek to produce output level where they try to maximize profit. And that point is where marginal revenue goes marginal cost. I keep talking about that, but it's a pretty important relationship that does come up again and again. Okay. Okay. Let me see here. Okay. Let's see. Also, there's a difference then between and I mentioned this a second ago, the difference between demand and marginal revenue in perfect competition, where in perfect competition, unlike monopoly, where it's a horizontal demand curve. Perfect competition, it's horizontal demand curve. In monopoly, you've got this case in which you've got a demand curve here and a marginal revenue curve here. And so as a result, you've got a split between these, and the marginal revenue curve lies below the demand curve, and it's a steeper slope. And as a result of this, demand and marginal revenue are not one and the same. But the firm will still price its product at the output level at which marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So if marginal cost comes in like that, the firm will still mark the price up here to produce the monopoly price, and it will produce the profit maximizing quantity right there. Okay? And as a result of that, that will be the idea that the firm will charge a bit higher price than perfect competition. And there'll be more on this as well in chapter 12 when we talk about some of the problems with monopolies. Some of them should be obvious. There's higher prices than the competitive price, etc. Okay. All right. Let me see here a minute. So you want to know what the characteristics of monopoly are. You also want to know about natural monopoly, where a natural monopoly is a kind of monopoly in which no firm can enter because it doesn't make sense to enter, because only one firm can supply the output. Where if another firm comes in, all that is being done here is cutting back on economies of scale, where you slide back the other direction. All you're doing is dividing up the market share, and it doesn't make sense. So this is why very big producers like utilities, electric utilities, water companies, almost always operate as monopolies, because of the fact that it doesn't make sense for more than one firm to supply the bulk of the output. Okay. All right, let me see here. Talk about marginal revenue and demand in case of monopoly. And then you want to know about this idea that if you become a monopoly, what is the concern that you'll do? Well, you'll have higher prices, you'll have lower output level, and you'll restrict entry to other competitors trying to come in. And we're going to talk a lot more about this idea of restriction of new competitors. That's why barriers to entry exist. That's what the benefit of barriers to entry are for monopoly firms, is to keep competitors out. They don't want competitors. That's the point. What's the point of being a monopoly if you end up having competitors? So as a result, you don't want competitors. And by not having competitors, you get to lock them out and then set the price higher than the price that would be set in the case of perfect competition. That's really part of the whole point there. Okay. And then you will tend to have positive economic profits in monopoly. So unlike perfect competition, again, this is one of those turned around on its head, where we said perfect competition was the North Pole, monopoly was South Pole, whatever kind of polar opposite example you want to use. In the case of monopolies, they tend to earn economic profit consistently year after year. Whereas in perfect competition, it's possible in the short run only. In the long run, we're saying it's not possible. Okay. Let me see here. We're getting pretty close to the end of this as well. So whatever time we're meeting, I'll be able to take questions for everybody. But let me just make sure I've covered everything that I was going to cover on the exam. I think there's a graph. There's a question involving a graph somewhere here. Oh, one thing about the marginal revenue in monopoly is that as the firm sells more output, as it goes this direction on the output vector, it's losing incremental marginal revenue. So this is why the firm restricts output. In perfect competition, where supply and demand come together, is where the output level is. So there's more output being produced in perfect competition. Remember, supply and marginal cost being one and the same here. But in the case of monopoly, the firm will produce where, like all products, because demand and marginal revenue are not one and the same as they are in perfect competition. The firm will supply where marginal revenue is marginal cost, and then find the price the demand side is willing to pay for it, so that it's a lower quantity than perfect competition will produce. So that's really one of the issues there. But also know about this negative price effect, that the reason that they'll do it, they don't want to keep producing output level here because it just brings down their marginal revenue. And that's not the point, because if marginal revenue begins to decline below marginal cost, then you get to the situation where you're putting a quarter in the slot machine, so you're going to get dying back out. That's not what the intent is, not at all. Okay. And let me see here. Okay, and there's a question dealing with the graph that you want to be able to interpret the graph. That is to how to calculate what the cost of production is. And the cost of production is simple, and it's a geographical region. And basically, what you're going to want to do is simply take the quantity level times the average total cost, and then just simply it's a rectangular area. But the output level is given, okay? the upper level is given, and then the cost, I mean, it's all given on the graph, but it's just simply an interpretation of that, where you'll just simply be trying to determine, what the costs are equal to. And its average total cost is the level that you want to key off of, all the way back to the axis and the origin. Okay, so it's basically going to be, if you have average total cost coming in somewhere like this, it's going to be all the way back to this particular region there, from quantity and average total cost here. Average total cost is also sometimes the same as average cost. It's the same thing basically. So it's that region back to the origin and to the axis. Okay, and you can look at in the text for questions and examples on those particular questions there. And I think that is it. I don't have a full class session today, simply because of the fact that all I was really planning to do was review for the exam. So for those of you on the live link, are there any questions that I can answer for you regarding the exam? I know I can't hear you, unfortunately, but I'm more than glad to, if you want to key something into the chat box, I'll be more than able to respond to you right now in real time. Okay, well, if you do, I'll be here for a bit. And so you can feel free to do that. And otherwise, I'll go ahead and this video will, obviously, for those who are watching it after the fact, it's available in the YouTube link, and it'll be available for you to, let me see, I think there's a chat. Oh, okay, thank you today. Anyway, hopefully this was helpful to you. If you do have questions, feel free to get with me, just send me an email or call me, whichever you prefer. I'm on campus all the time, Monday through Thursday. I'm not usually here Friday so much. Well, I think I may be actually this week on Friday, but feel free to get with me. If you need to meet with me in person, it might be best just to set up a time, just that I'm sure that I'm here rather than floating around between here and another building, because I don't want to miss you, obviously. So, but feel free to do that. Otherwise, I wish everybody luck on the exam, and good luck with it. Study hard, hopefully, and we will see you next time. Okay.